matter of science. Evolution. Isn't it, gentlemen? Drago is the most perfectly trained athlete ever. This other man has not the size, or the endurance, or the genetics to win. It's physically impossible for this little man to win.
I'm Jay Solo. Hello. This fourth part of this series is by far the most important, because the misunderstanding of the reality of this subject has, can, will, and does very much lead to devastating consequences for many. I have divided this topic into two parts, and I have had to greatly summarize each point of discussion to give a concise explanation on the most important points relevant to this series. I kindly ask that you watch both parts for full context, as one without the other may fail to give a solid and efficient explanation of this topic. In this part, we will discuss the history and science, especially genetic, behind human intelligence, and in the next part we will discuss and focus on how the contemporary condition persists, also briefly touching on the matter of eugenics. It is first and foremost important to understand that there is no universally accepted definition of human intelligence, because so far every definition neglects or misunderstands one aspect or another of what could potentially count as a significant factor contributing to intelligence. The disagreements on the definition of human intelligence also means disputes in the methods of measuring intelligence, because a person's intelligence cannot be measured directly. However, we know that the intelligence allows us to learn, form concepts, understand, apply logic and reason, give us the capacity to recognize patterns, plan, innovate, solve problems, make decisions, retain information, and use language to communicate. What researchers have generally looked for when trying to measure intelligence are fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence. Crystallized intelligence refers to the knowledge and skills one acquires. Fluid intelligence refers to the application of that knowledge, such as in problem solving and one's ability to reason and understand abstract concepts. Psychometricians generally agree that IQ tests are reliable, in that the tests tend to produce consistent, reproducible scores. But as for its validity, as in if the test actually tests what it's intended to test, IQ tests fail to do so in a few ways, because they do not directly measure intelligence, and do not at all measure other important facets of intelligence, such as social intelligence, innovation, and creativity, which are important in different parts of society. Much of the style of IQ tests generally test how well and quickly one can identify and make sense of patterns and find logic in problem solving. They usually start relatively easy and proceed to become more and more difficult, and can be pretty draining, especially considering that you're also being measured on the speed at which you respond correctly, and so there's a time limit. I think due to the stigma and sometimes intimidation of the term IQ, sometimes when asked to take an IQ test, examiners will not refer to it as an IQ test. Other limitations of these tests include what's known as differential item functioning. That basically, people of different groups, such as people of different genders, cultures, and disabilities, sometimes have a tendency to respond in a similar manner to IQ tests, but giving incorrect answers. One will notice that white European students may have a tendency to give certain answers, while Mexican students may have a different tendency, which overall makes sense when considering that IQ tests were invented by Europeans, and it is therefore difficult to find a means of excluding cultural biases to tests. There are other limitations and serious issues regarding IQ tests that render it impossible to determine one's intelligence, but it is worth noting that there are definite correlations between a person's IQ and their outcome in life in terms of a few things, such as social class, life expectancy, number of offspring, and income. This is a general tendency, and as you know, correlation does not necessarily mean causation. And so people who brag about their IQ are not considered obnoxious, cringy, or annoying just because the world is full of jealous dum-dums who wish they were smart. It's because many people generally know of the inefficiencies of IQ tests, and that it doesn't always mean that the person lives or behaves much differently from anyone else. It also says nothing about their character or morals, or where their intelligence and reasoning ultimately leads them. For example, it generally doesn't matter to a person whether a person has a high IQ or not if they disagree with their political or religious beliefs. In fact, people may altogether conclude that an individual is an idiot on the basis of those things. Besides that, while there are indisputably many positive outcomes of a high intelligence for businesses, government, and one's personal life, high intelligence is and can be used for sinister purposes, such as planning various crimes or atrocities. Some of the most prolific serial killers, for example, had high IQs. And this is in fact something that some people brag about and prioritize. That if given the choice of being a psychopath with a high intelligence and being an empathetic individual with an average or regular intelligence, they would choose high intelligence. Though it's important to note that these things don't necessarily correlate. Many criminals and people who have committed atrocities had below average IQ levels. This in fact leads us to finally discussing this in the context of this series. People in professions such as teaching, mathematics, and some analytical sciences find worth in IQ tests as a quick way of narrowing down people that may be apt for the kind of work as part of the hiring process. A higher intelligence is almost always a benefit in a profession, but there are others who have a desperate obsession with IQ for more political, ideological, and very much personal reasons. Racial supremacists, and in Western countries, white supremacists specifically. White supremacists. No, white supremacist. Nope. Nope. Nope again. It just keeps going. Yeah. Sorry about that. It just takes a while to shuffle through the pygmies until you get to the white supremacists who actually consider themselves white. Whatever white means. Now, as we've seen in the first part of this series, for as long as the idea of racial classification has been around, so has the idea of inferior and superior races, particularly with regards to intelligence. It was simply assumed common knowledge that Africans were of an inferior intelligence than Europeans. This assumption was usually cemented by writers, thinkers, and natural so-called scientists who set out to try to prove this belief in various ways. Early on, the most appealing way of doing this was through religion, by demonstrating the hierarchy of races by supernatural means, since that's what appealed to most people at the time. However, as science began to have a greater influence on people's understanding of things and their opinions, more and more books were written and interest placed on proving superiority and inferiority of races by scientific means. And this actually led to cruel and corrupt practices to not prove the case, but to actively engineer the inferiority of other races. Belgians abducted people from the Congo and placed them in human zoos in Europe as spectacles to amuse and amaze Belgians and demonstrate that Africans were uncivilized, unintelligent, inhuman savages inferior to the white man, which was specifically done to provide justification for colonialism and the atrocities committed against the Congolese as necessary. White Americans deprived black slaves in America from even going near a book to perpetuate the lie that black people can't be educated and to keep them uneducated. German scientists used captured Herero people in Namibia as test subjects for experiments intended to prove the superiority of the white race in every way, including intellectual. The skulls of the unfortunate victims were in fact only returned in 2011, and these experiments inspired the experiments Nazis conducted shortly after. In South Africa, under apartheid, one of the lesser-known, truly cruel things that the government did was that the regional director of Bantu education, J.G. Erasmus, enforced that from the 1st of January 1975, Afrikaans, the language of the Boer citizenry, was to be used for mathematics, arithmetic, and social studies. English was to be used as a medium of instruction for general science and practical subjects such as needlework, homecraft, woodwork, metalwork, arts, and agricultural science. Indigenous languages could therefore only be used for religious instruction, music, and physical culture, thus depriving indigenous Africans who spoke little English and no Afrikaans from learning these very important subjects. In Australia, from the 1890s to 1949, indigenous students could be removed from state schools and placed in reserve schools, where education was abysmal, if white parents simply requested it. I could go on describing the injustices that were committed against black people regarding education, but what's most puzzling is that despite this recent history, there are still many people, particularly in places where black people are few, who believe that there must be an intellectual inferiority inherent within black people, completely ignoring and dismissing the deliberate mitigation of learning among black students all over the world. People tend to think that eras such as that of slavery, Jim Crow, colonialism, apartheid, and the massacre that's remembered as Black Wall Street, as though they were in antiquity, when in reality it only became illegal to discriminate on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in what we describe as the land of the free 59 years ago. Many teenagers of that time are still very much alive today. Apartheid in South Africa ended only 31 years ago. Generations of people who were systematically, and I repeat, systematically, deprived of a quality education could not possibly bequeath an intellect of the average white person onto their children. Because what most white people do not realize is that they not only had a head start in the realm of the most modern organized education available since the Renaissance onwards, but governments, religious men, as well as men of science have either occasionally or consistently engineered the deprivation, prohibition, and weakening of the knowledge and intellectual potential and opportunities of many black people over whom they presided. I mean, just to illustrate the lack of modern knowledge in some places, Henry Morton Stanley was able to scare Africans in the Congo with a magnifying glass by starting a fire and threatening to call down the power of the sun to burn down entire villages. The people with their own eyes saw that he could start a fire in a way they could not understand, and practically the entire world believed in some superstition or another at the time. And so the Africans simply believed that white people must have had some supernatural abilities. The mass conversion of many into Christianity didn't help, as no African was to be ordained as a priest, and so it was a continuous conditioning of inferiority into the minds of both blacks and the rest of the world. However, many who interacted with free Africans in Europe, the colonies, the Americas, and the Caribbean knew even back then from experience that this inferiority was a myth. Charles Darwin, to a degree, was among such people. The saddest part of all of this, however, is that in the midst of the victimization, atrocities, injustices, and genocides, there were very well accomplished, free, and successful blacks who accomplished tremendous works and inventions that are still used today. Garrett Morgan invented a number of hair care products, the first traffic signal, and the safety hood smoke protection device for firefighters. Richard Spikes developed and patented the automatic brake system, the pantograph, brake testing machine, among other inventions and improvements of inventions. Alice Augusta Ball developed what we now know as the Ball method, a technique to make Chalmugra oil injectable and absorbable to and by the human body, thus making it the most effective treatment of leprosy at the time. The list truly goes on, but despite this free, easily accessible information, many people of all walks of life have been preconditioned to believe in the outdated 19th and 20th century ideas of the hierarchy of races, due to decades of an endless tirade of stereotypes, media, religious, scientific, and political beliefs, misconceptions, and straight-up indoctrination of the inferiority and superiority of races. They then point to and emphasize, and sometimes exaggerate, all negative collective factors associated with Africans or people of African heritage. One common example is how they refer to the instability in African countries as a testament to general African intelligence or temperament, or both. This is one of the most frustrating misconceptions, as it demonstrates the ignorance, hypocrisy, and cognitive dissonance among those with such misunderstandings. After the DRC gained its independence, for example, a part of the country tried to secede from the rest to become its own nation and keep much of the country's minerals and riches for themselves. This began a conflict, and the first Congolese Prime Minister, Patrice Lumumba, sought aid from the United States to resolve the issue. When the United States was unwilling, Lumumba sought help from the USSR, and the US of course couldn't have that, since this would quote-unquote open the doors to communism in one of the African continent's most influential countries. And so the US under Eisenhower, and through the official sanctioning of the CIA, planned and executed the capture, torture, and assassination of the Prime Minister. This was in fact unnecessary, since Lumumba and the rest of the country hated communism. He just needed help from any country that was willing to do so, since the United States refused. The US then supported and helped bring to power Mobutu Sese Seko, a cruel dictator who committed many crimes against humanity and bankrupted the country through a kleptocracy and his enrichment and the enrichment of his family and entourage. The country today has not fully recovered because Western countries such as France are still supporting rebel groups, mostly comprising of Rwandan men, who continue to massacre Congolese people in the East to obtain the most valuable land and deal with other countries. The hypocrisy of white supremacists to claim that this sort of instability is a result of the low intelligence of Africans rather than the direct involvement of Western governments is astounding. Of course, there are other factors that contribute to the instability as it exists today, such as corruption and nepotism, but it also requires an incredible amount of cognitive dissonance to ignore the instability and violence happening in predominantly white countries. Another common lie that is circulated mostly among Western right-wing circles is that no sub-Saharan African civilization invented the wheel. This is in fact false, and quite easy to explain. Firstly, rock art portrays ox carts as early as before the 3rd century CE, which is long before European contact. The potter's wheel and water wheel were in common practice in West Africa long before European arrival as well. In 1866 and 1870, we have European accounts of carriages, sometimes drawn by mules, being used in ceremonial processions for kings. Africans independently invented, produced, and made use of the wheel. That's not the issue. The question is, why was wheeled transport so uncommon in sub-Saharan Africa? Now, anyone who's been to the most tropical parts of Africa, I'm mostly referring to Central Africa here, will know of how unsteady the terrain is due to vast vegetation and forestry. And with no roads, especially through the jungle, the most efficient means of transporting goods and materials was by pack animals and through human porterage. Even after African civilizations had been in contact with civilizations that commonly used the wheel, using carriages or carts on certain terrains would be counterproductive and time-consuming to repair when the abundant availability of livestock was ever present. This explanation is not new, and knowing the terrain of Central and West African countries quite well makes perfect sense to me anyway. But when presented with this information, white supremacists who are more interested in this topic than anyone else these days deny it outright in an eerily similar way that they deny other things, such as the Holocaust. And they do so due to one primary reason. Their ideology depends on the notion that the superiority and inferiority of so-called races is on the basis of genetics. This is why much of their effort goes into trying to prove notions of heredity. To them, the most important notion of which is with regards to intelligence. So if they can measure intelligence down to a single score, then they have an easy means of showing the overall intelligence of a race without accounting for reasons that explain the score. So let's address the genetics question directly, which is not if genetics is the determinant of intelligence, but rather how much of it is responsible as opposed to environmental factors. This is widely known as the nature versus nurture debate. The most well-studied findings for the hereditability of IQ are from Western countries, and they show that IQ has a high heritability percentage because much of the process of logical reasoning that the parent holds can be transferred onto the child. But the IQ and other forms of intelligence of the child will mostly depend on the child's health, nutrition, education, upbringing, disabilities if any, and physical environment from birth until about the age of 25, when it becomes more and more difficult to increase one's IQ. And yes, IQ can be increased. The genetic effects from the parents tend to lead a child with a high logical reasoning to seek out environments and activities that challenge and stimulate their mind more. However, it's not to say that this interest for learning or thinking logically cannot be shaped in the child. If a child is surrounded by peers with no interest in learning or stimulating their minds, regardless of the genetic predisposition of the child, it may lead him or her away from developing a higher intellect. As for the physical brain, there are several factors that have been proven to at least correlate between a person's neurophysiology and intelligence. This is obvious since the brain is the body's central processing unit. Regarding IQ, the size and shape, as well as the amount of blood and chemical activity in and of the frontal lobes, may have an effect on IQ, as well as the thickness of the cortex, glucose metabolic rate, and amount of gray matter in the brain. This is particularly important because one factor that directly and largely affects brain development is nutrition, of both the child after birth, but also the nutrition of the pregnant mother. Studies are continuously released revealing different types of healthy food that can lead to a better overall health and development of children in terms of their nutrition. For example, meat consumption does have an effect on the development of the brain. The lack of meat in one's diet may have a negative impact on brain formation. And so even if one may have had a child with a high intellect, a pregnant mother's unhealthy ingestion can hinder that, as well as what guardians will feed the child after birth. Developed nations that have understood the direct link between health and intelligence have put in place policies that require fortification of food products and controlling pollution levels for this very reason. Countries that do not do this due to lack of development and government control will not be able to control such things. I will enter the actual reasons for lower IQ levels among black populations in the next part of this series in full detail. But these are just a few reasons as to why the scientific consensus is that genetics is not the primary factor for the differences in IQ between groups, whether by race or ethnicity. However, there is one reason that I wish to briefly introduce in this part regarding the gap in academic achievement between blacks and whites, at least in America, and that reason is birth rate. In the previous parts of this series, we discussed sex and sexual attitudes among black populations because this is one of the unfortunate consequences of communities with overly liberal attitudes towards sex. When many children in black communities are born unintentionally, parents are often not prepared to provide an upbringing that is above adequate, and sometimes not even adequate at all. There is a serious issue of mothers priding themselves for providing the bare minimum of the child's needs when that is quite expected of them in the first place. Some don't wish to have an abortion because they cannot afford it, or they are pressured or encouraged to have the child, or because they wish to avoid gaining a negative reputation of fleeing from their responsibilities, quote unquote. What they don't realize are the realities of actually having the child, and by that time it's far too late, as a child is born into an environment that does not value an education, an ineffective school system that provides a mediocre education, and an entourage that does not think ahead. and unfortunately the cycle continuously repeats itself. This is part of what makes intelligence heritable, and where genetics does ultimately play a part in it. But the better part is that although many people do not know it because they never ask, IQ is not static throughout one's life. It changes over time. It may start out low in some and increase over time, and vice versa. Also, genes do not necessarily determine one's fate. Ultimately, it is in the hands of those who care about such things to do something about it. A person can inherit a high intellect from their parents, just as a person can inherit height and phenotypic traits such as eye and hair color, but not always. Parents with blonde hair and blue eyes can have a ginger child with brown eyes. A short couple can have a very tall child, and a couple with a high IQ can have a child with an average IQ. The chances exist to be higher or lower, but it is not solely up to fate, and that is the science of the matter. Now, there is a misconception that must be dispelled. It is that the hereditarian position, that is the belief that heredity plays a significant role in determining human nature and character traits such as intelligence and personality, and even criminality, is one that is backed by science, and that the reluctance to study humans by race to determine a genetic cause for their level of intelligence obstructs the scientific process that could better the human stock, even for black people. This is not entirely true. Firstly, there is no study that conclusively demonstrates that genetics solely or even mostly determines intelligence. Studies that have sought to do so are considered invalid by most geneticists on scientific grounds, such as flawed methodology, convincing allegations of forgery, lack of sufficient data, and most importantly, exclusion of data contradicting the position. And those are for just the recent examples, not only from studies from the 19th and 20th centuries. Meanwhile, studies and evidence for the environmental impacts on intelligence are overwhelming. Now, some argue that this is due to the lack of studies on race and genetics that give an impression that environmental factors trump genetics. The reason this is the case is in part due to taboo and the association of such tests with those conducted in Nazi Germany and Japan in the 20th century, due to major reasons such as race being a poorly constructed categorization of humans that arbitrarily groups people on ideological grounds rather than scientific or biological, but also because of the demonstrable preponderance of evidence that also trumps genetic correlations with regard to intelligence, as well as the so-called intelligence gap between races. The reason this matters so much to those who study it is because of the ideals and beliefs of those who advocate for it, despite the scientific evidence against them. The Pioneer Fund is one of the largest organizations established precisely to advance scientific study of the heredity of human differences, particularly intelligence, because, as you may or may not be surprised to learn, they are a white supremacist organization that modeled some of their studies on Nazi breeding programs, and one of their first projects was funding the distribution of Nazi eugenicist propaganda in US churches and schools. So it should come as no surprise that they financed the publishing of the public statement entitled Mainstream Science on Intelligence, that lists 25 so-called conclusions regarded as mainstream among researchers on intelligence, quote-unquote. Among these 25, they try to reinstate that intelligence can be measured and that IQ tests measure them well as how Asians have a higher intelligence than whites, and whites have a higher intelligence than Hispanics, and Hispanics have a higher intelligence than blacks. The statements had a number of issues and points of contentions, particularly on IQ tests, the signatories, the majority of whom were not even experts in the field to begin with, and of course the issue of how they define intelligence. The hereditarian ideology behind those promoting genetic intelligence heredity is what drives them, not the pursuit of science. It is in pursuit of answering a question that will justify their pre-existing pseudoscientific beliefs, and the given answers from actual scientific research do not satisfy them, as it directly contradicts their beliefs of a racial hierarchy in terms of intelligence. The entire matter is political and ideological. It is done for those purposes, not a scientific one. This is why when social programs that were intended to eliminate the disparities in academic performance in Western countries do not do as well as we would hope, their first go-to is genetics, rather than reasons as to why it failed, such as lack of funding, unqualified teachers, or other socioeconomic problems. When a black child fails a test or cannot concentrate in class, it's genetics rather than the many factors that may be impacting him or her. When a white child does badly, it's suddenly due to environmental factors that impacted his or her studies. Their solution, therefore, is to simply breed out the inferior stock through eugenic practices. However, besides the moral implications, there are scientific reasons as to why eugenics may not necessarily succeed. I will expand and explain this particular point in the next part, as well as the actual proven reasons that explain the intellectual and academic disparities, particularly regarding black communities around the world. I've already begun this by explaining the history of the racist systematic mitigation of education and intellectualism against Africans, and so I will now enter into the details of the situation as it exists today. I kindly ask that you watch it in order to have full context of this topic. I'm G.A. Sola. Goodbye.
How in the hell does an ignorant nigger got knowledge like that?
The ignorant one thinking like that. People make him out to be ignorant, but far from it. In fact, what's worse is they tend to be persistent.